or know about the project, but we'll talk about sort of largely what we have done in the past related to floodplain management. As Tom said, a starting point for future discussions in the North Reach. Specifically, the floodplain considerations were actually, they're incorporated into the E-zone discussion that we had last month, where basically some of the minimums in terms of where different environmental zones are applied are incorporated into that, but those are largely focused on the Columbia River, just the floodplain in the Columbia River that are industrial, and then the lower slough. So it's a little bit more narrow than in the North Reach. So we'll talk about it more generally, recognize that it's a part of the E-zones as well in terms of our considerations, but really focused on the North Reach.
And I forgot to make one important note that this work is not as far along as the Columbia Corridor E-zones. So think of this as more early scoping, issue identification. We don't have a lot of, we've begun to map, but we don't have a lot of scenarios to go through yet. So this is very early work in progress stuff.
Right, and I think as we do go into, especially the North Reach, it's about sort of different levers that we can pull, both specifically for the floodplain, but then also the considerations for the river environmental zone that in theory apply to the North Reach as a part of that project. So yeah, we'll just go through some background. So Jason, I'll do some zoning code considerations from what we did in the past, and Jason, so the Bureau of Development Services manages our building regulations, so what we usually refer to as the building code, and there's components of floodplain requirements that are incorporated into that portion of the work. So Jason will go through that, and then we'll have any questions you have, and then go into the specifics of kind of background in the North Reach. And then, yeah, Caitlin is here to just talk a little bit about our work that we have been already is a sort of ongoing related to mitigation banks and with the North Reach, the mitigation bank. Okay, so a little bit of background. I know some of you may be more involved than others, but the primary driver for the floodplain work is that in the Natural Flood Insurance Program, FEMA's Natural Flood Insurance Program, as a result of a lawsuit that was brought against FEMA, it was determined, and that was like in 2009, that the actual lawsuit was brought by Portland Audubon and some other environmental organizations. As a result of that lawsuit, FEMA was required to consult with the National Marine Fisheries Service to determine whether the National Flood Insurance Program impacted threatened and endangered species, as all federal agencies are required to do. Through that process, it was determined that the National Flood Insurance Program does impact 16 threatened and endangered species through the essentially the allowance of development in the floodplain and the role and the value of floodplain to those threatened and endangered species. So that biological, what's called a biological opinion, makes that determination. That was released in 2016. We knew that was coming, and there was another similar biological opinion that was already in effect in the Puget Sound area. So the city had been working before that 2016 date, but since then working collectively across bureaus to prepare for these changes. And that's the three of us, Jason and Caitlin and I, have been involved in that, like I said, from that time. In 2021, October 2021, FEMA released what they believe is their sort of general implementation plan. It's sort of more of their direction as to how they're going to respond to it. And so through the combination of the biological opinion and the implementation plan, this is sort of our guidance for how we are managing or updating our requirements for floodplains. So as I said, we've been working collaboratively as a sort of inter-bureau, cross-bureau group. We have a 5-year work plan that was adopted in 2018, technically 19, that really laid out the commitments of all of the different bureaus across the city to respond to these things. There's basically 3 primary goals that we're really looking for. Is we need to ensure that we continue to comply with the FEMA requirements so that we have access to flood insurance, the Natural Flood Insurance Program, and then also disaster relief funds. Of course, we're also looking to reduce flood risk. And then fundamentally, this is really about improving the habitat for threatened and endangered species. That 5-year work plan technically is running was technically till 2024. So we are currently in the process of thinking about how we update that work plan and what it means to look forward. But we'll talk about our different phases that we've already completed to date. So this is what we're calling the combined flood hazard area. So the city of Portland essentially regulates two different flood plains as it stands right now. One is the FEMA 100-year floodplain, which is technically the scope of the biological opinion and where those requirements apply. And then we also, per metro requirements, regulate what's called the 1996 flood inundation area. And that is literally they looked at aerial photos and determined the extent of the February 1996 flood. That's one of our most recent major floods, and established this map where regulations apply per our metro regional government. So we regulate both of those in different ways, and we'll talk about that. Additionally, and Jason will talk a little bit more about this, but we have more recently worked with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to produce a model, an updated model of a 1996 like flood, to understand, because it is so long ago, what the extent of that flood, a similar flood, would look like given current development and current characteristics along the Willamette River. So basically, the model goes from the Willamette Falls all the way down to the confluence, and has some portions of included for the Columbia, just near the confluence of the two.
Jeff, can I just add one? That model, the updated model, is actually being used by EPA as part of the Portland Harbor cleanup. So it's already involved in Superfund and the North Ocean.
Yeah. And again, we'll talk more specifically about Superfund in the next session. But so the general overall timeline here, we won't get into too many details, but right now FEMA is going through the National Environmental Policy Act basically review. They have completed scoping for that implementation plan that I talked about. The expectation is that jurisdictions in Oregon will need to be compliant by early 2027. We have taken a phased approach, which is there on the bottom, to really recognition of the complexity of our zoning code, as I'm sure you all are familiar with, and also so there's these different areas where we regulate differently and have different considerations, so that we can give the time necessary to each of these steps. And we have completed the first two here in the orange is all sort of the zoning code updates. We did the River Plant South Reach, which was adopted in 2020, December 2020. We have recently completed the floodplain resilience plan. And then we have the EOA, those changes, the North Reach, and then all that will be remaining after this work is really focused on Johnson Creek. And so the Bureau of Development Services, along with these steps, especially starting now with the floodplain resilience plan, has been updating the development regulations, so the building regulations, Title 24 requirements in these same areas along with us. Throughout this whole process, we're focused on mitigation, like we said, we'll talk about that, but also restoration opportunities for a floodplain to contribute to demonstrating compliance with the biological opinion once it is required, in addition to just our regulations that we comply.
Jeff, can I ask you something just for fun? So what day did Metro take those? I never heard this before about Metro in the 1996. What day in that flood did they do flyover, or just, I thought they were just using photos, but they did an actual flyover during that flood?
You may know, but it's the day after. It's actually the morning after the peak flooding in February of 1996.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. So our understanding is that the aerial imagery was flown, so it wasn't driven light over the area the morning after. So it doesn't necessarily encompass peak flows, but it does show the boundary.
So what day in February,
I have to look at it.
Oh, okay, just curious.
But then Metro adopted those requirements in 2000.
And then
But it was just a reference flood.
and did they have those online, those photos?
I'm not sure if those photos from. I know that we have a hard copy. So
It would be fun to see. Just because I like maps.
We have some images of those. I have some images of havoc shows of like just flooding that happened on that day. So unless there's any other questions, just moving on.
I've got a related question to that. How does that 96, I mean, that makes sense to kind of look at the 96 flood and say, hey, this is where the water went, but how does that mesh with federal standards? Usually it's 1% chance of flood. So is that 96 flood a 1% chance of flood, 0.5%? Where does that
I'll defer to Jason. I think generally it's viewed as kind of like a 1% chance flood, but
So the 1996 flood was the result of rain on snow events that occurred both in the, Columbia watershed as well as the Willamette. And so what we saw, when you plot the water surface elevations on Columbia and on the Willamette, see is that measured water surface elevation on Columbia was 1 foot higher than the modeled 100-year flood.
I'm sorry,
1 foot higher.
what higher?
So I think it's a larger flood event. And then similarly on the Willamette, we saw about an 18-inch rise. So when you plot the elevations and you look at the 100-year, 500-year, it plots much closer to 100. It is an event that appears to have a longer reoccurrence.
So how, in terms of federal regulations, if you're looking at the 96, using 96 flood as a standard, the federal regulations are saying our standard is 1%, or maybe the standard goes to,
Correct.
whatever it is, how do you resolve that disconnect?
Keep
well, actually, maybe we can just hold up. We'll talk about that. And I will say, one thing I will say though is that I would say sometimes the 100 year is greater than what was shown in the 1996 flood, and sometimes it's less. And then the other piece of it, which we don't necessarily get into, is that the 100-year floodplain, as it currently stands, is pretty significantly out of date. And so
That's not my question.
Yeah.
The question is, how do you miss with the federal regulations?
yeah,
in the long story made short is there are Title 20. So regulated to a higher standard. So that helps us to get a better scoring system, CRS program, which then in turn
I mean, the drainage district, we're aiming for 500-year protection, so it's not a matter of which is right. It's a matter of, are we talking the same language? 96 versus 1%.
yeah. And so we are required, as I said, to regulate the 1996 via Metro, but the only real federal kind of connection is what Jason said. The fact that we regulate that additional area gives us additional points in the FEMA community rating system that then equates to those further reductions in the rates for the insurance policies.
Yeah, thanks.
Before you continue, I think some of the folks online are having a hard time hearing everyone, and I know it's hard. There's a fan on the back over here too. So as much as you can speak up, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
So just a little bit, we're just going to sort of as a baseline, start with what we have recently adopted as a part of our efforts, both the South Reach specifically. We did some updates in the South Reach, but then also the floodplain resilience plan. And then that'll be just sort of, again, the starting point for future discussions about the North Reach, et cetera. But so really when the previous updates have been the Central Reach is basically Fremont Bridge South. There are a couple of industrial properties along in the Central Reach that we have carved out that aren't technically in what we call the Central Reach. South Reach goes from essentially Ross Island Bridge down to our urban services boundary. So we do planning for areas that are unincorporated in Multnomah County. We also made changes in Faneuil Creek, and Tryon Creek. They aren't necessarily highlighted here because it's a little different in both along the Columbia River flood in the Columbia River floodplain and the John Street floodplain. We made changes to the environmental overlay zones that do apply there, but not sort of a more robust evaluation. Any changes to the zoning and things like that, which will be part of this future project. So for us, from the zoning code perspective, this next phase would be really looking at all of the North Reach, the Columbia Slough, and the Columbia River floodplain. We did not make any changes in terms of, like I said, the extent of the zoning, et cetera. And that's really all, as I said, at least for the corridor, is all part of the Columbia Corridor Industrial Land Project that we talked about last session. And then, yes, a future North Reach project. And then the Johnson Creek will be a separate effort for us. So just to kind of give basics of the requirements that we're looking at, I mean, the biological opinion had three main components. It was specifically about kind of habitat mitigation. So what we normally think about habitat, so trees and vegetation management, how that works, stormwater management, and then flood storage. And so the flood storage is making sure, and that's partly our requirements within the Metro 1996, is if you put fill or a structure in the floodplain, that you are maintaining that same capacity for floodwater by excavating a similar, the same volume to offset it. The first piece of it for the habitat portion, there was one thing in the biological opinion that was specifically higher mitigation standards for the area within 170 feet of ordinary high water. That's called the riparian buffer. It was called the riparian buffer zone in the biological opinion, but we call it the riparian buffer area, so there's not a confusion about zoning and things. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but the key is that the biological opinion, so if the floodplain doesn't go 170 feet, then the riparian buffer area also doesn't go 170 feet. It is contained by the extent of the floodplain, the riparian buffer. And a note is that it really, that is focused on for those developments and uses that are not river dependent, river related. There is an allowance in the biological opinion similar to what we have in our code for river dependent, river related uses, which is critical in the North Reach, as all of you know. So we're really looking to make sure beyond that sort of narrow area, the higher priority area and higher mitigation ratios, also looking to make sure we have environmental zoning, either those that we talked about last session or the river environmental, or what, which would be the expectation of all of the Willamette, to have all of our specifically undeveloped floodplain, so vegetated floodplain within an environmental zone at the end of this whole process. And then also just making sure that how we're managing those trees and vegetation, et cetera, through these different mechanisms is consistent and complies with the biological opinion. So just wanted to talk a little bit about the riparian buffer area. So it may extend beyond any development setback that we have. Often it can be contained within the setback, and we'll talk about sort of considerations on development setback for the North Reach here in the North Reach section, but and especially in the North Reach, there are some properties where it extends beyond that, or it can be substantially beyond that. But in a lot of cases, it's the floodplain is contained to the river, to the sort of the floodway, and it doesn't extend onto properties too far. But when it does, it is not, if it goes beyond, if you can develop in there, it's not a no build zone, but it does require additional mitigation and sort of fish habitat improvements is basically what the requirement was for the biological opinion. And we would then, through the land use review, you would demonstrate improvements to that area to improve fish habitat. That mitigation might include things like additional trees, removal of impervious surfaces. It can basically, the extent and type of improvements will depend on how much you're proposing to develop in that riparian buffer area, and then what is possible on the site. If it's not possible to do it on site, we have regulations that allow for offsite mitigation, and we'll talk about that as we said, because mitigation banking is one key option for that. Well, this just gives you sort of general, like a couple of ideas. Removal of riprap. They may not; these don't necessarily fit in every situation. Removal of riprap to again create more of a natural bank. Additional vegetation and trees, et cetera, to try to again, and especially when the idea is like when we have flooding, there are these areas of respite for fish, and they have the ability to get back to the river once the flood recedes.
I have a question. So how do these sync up with some of the safety requirements that are required by the federal government, say like the Maritime Administration? If they're in conflict, what's the resolution for that?
Well, I guess I'd have to know a little bit more about the specifics. I mean, again, if it is something that is viewed as a river dependent, river related sort of use or function, then you would still need to meet the section we're going here is the cut fill requirements, the excavation requirements, but you would not need to meet that those additional mitigation requirements. I think one of the questions we'll need to figure out if there are specific things that, and I think in the North Reach, especially if there are things that are, I know that has come up in the past related to those, especially when we were, I think, previously working on the North Reach, and it was like post 9/11, and there was a lot more of this sort of security concern. And so I think as we move into whatever this a future North Reach effort, we would want to look at that and think about how we accommodate that or don't know what it means. I mean, what we are looking for to do as long term is to make sure at the end of all of this, for the floodplain requirements, is we'll submit a package to FEMA and say, we think this complies with the directives that you have given to all of the participating jurisdictions. And so as long as it can, in some ways, like I said, it's about these levers that we pull. If we can in total say that we think we're consistent, then that's our aim. So then, yeah. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jason to talk about more of the kind of on the building regulation side and the cut fill, which you normally know as cut fill.
Fantastic. So I'll try to speak up. Very good at that. Didn't take much theater in school.
Now's your chance.
Yes, quite. So I'm going to try to speak to the Title 24 regulations for floodplain developments. Again, these are our city building regulations, and they reflect our the minimum requirements necessary for us to participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, plus additional measures, which helps us again with our CRS ranking. So just earlier this year, we took those amendment to City Council to update our Title 24 regulations. And we brought two different exhibits to City Council, Exhibit A and Exhibit B. Most of what I'm going to be speaking to today is about Exhibit B. The Exhibit A changes were primarily just code updates to bring our model, our floodplain development ordinance, into closer alignment with the state model code for the National Flood Insurance Program. So those include changes such as requiring during construction elevation certificate, clarifying permit and inspection requirements, and those sorts of things. We did adopt the composite February 1996 in the Exhibit A. I'll be speaking to that in a moment. But it's primarily the Exhibit B changes with the additional flood storage compensation requirements that we'll be speaking to today. So conveniently, our first slide kicks off with our 1996 flood mitigation area. Like Jeff had talked about, the city adopted the Metro Type 3 boundary that shows both the February 1996 flood mitigation area, as well as the FEMA flood hazard area. Call this managed flood. The idea was that, again, the model, well, the February 1996 mitigation area sets that boundary based on imagery. So it reflects the flood conditions and the topography and development back in 1996. We had the opportunity to partner with U.S. Army Corps to develop an updated digital terrain model, which is the kind of the input parameters, if you will, for the lower Willamette, and we're able to utilize the 1996 flood as a calibration event. And so that gave us the opportunity to kind of fine tune the input parameters around that February model. And we thought, it would be, we would be able to take advantage of this effort and basically update our February 96 flood inundation area to reflect our best understanding of what that flood would look like. I just thought that was the boring meter.
We just sound that every time.
Back to
Somebody's forehead hit the table too. So the long story made short is that our composite map is just that. It's a composite of the existing Metro Title III flood inundation area, 1996 flood, and we've overlain and replaced portions in the central and south reach of the Willamette with our modeled results. We did not apply those modeled results to the industrial properties, which are G2 zones. I haven't said there were some, so they're not off the top of my head. So at any rate, we've adopted those changes and they're reflected in what we're now calling the composite February 1996 flood inundation. So what we're primarily talking about is the requirements for flood storage compensation. Our current requirements are based on a balanced cut and fill requirement that again came out of the Metro Title III ordinance. And so it's focused on the placement of fill. Again, it's focused on the placement of fill below the base flood elevation or the February 1996 flood inundation. And the requirement is that when fill is placed below those inundation elevations, an equal volume of soil removal is required to create that compensating storage. With the FEMA BIOP, what we saw was a change of not only are we looking at compensating for the placement of fill, but also looking at displaced floodwater structures. And so following that BIOP direction, we are updating the regulations for development in the FEMA to include both fill and structure. So the cartoon at the bottom here is just to try to illustrate that, the placement of fill and the creation of the excavation on the other side of the bank.
Sorry, Jason, I have a question. So I'm confused because one of our problems in the North Reach is fill. Because that's created unstable soil, which is the challenge of a Cascadia potential event. So are you saying we would create more fill? Like when we're not creating more fill?
No, we're trying to avoid the creation.
Oh, okay. I was like, isn't that the bit? So I don't, yeah. So we're not trying to cut and fill.
Well, it's just if you do place it, you are required to offset and mitigate that placement. And it's now both fill and structure. So if you put a building in the floodplain, right now, the way the balance got filled per the Metro requirements, it's just when you put soil or other material to sort of raise your building up, you have to offset that. Now, if you were even, and so if you had a building that actually was below the flood elevation where we think flooding is going to happen, you don't actually have to offset that per Metro requirements. Now you have to offset both the fill and the structure. So it wouldn't, it's kind of agnostic on whether fill is placed or not. It's just that you have to make sure that you're mitigated, that it's mitigated.
It's still confusing to me because if it's dangerous, it's dangerous. So from our perspective in the North Reaches, that fill is dangerous to us who live there.
And I don't think that's the perspective,
No.
at least under the code, because there's a separate set of seismic code standards
Oh,
that in addition to placing the fill, if you're, presumably you're building on top of it and you have to have a whole different set of seismic standards for whatever structure you're building that is presumably safe when it's built to those new seismic codes.
yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Not necessarily inherently dangerous.
So when this cartoon depicts the pat and fill looks like it's in the river, but I think what you may be talking, because those would be more of a NOAA jurisdiction for permits, which is not city.
They're both.
But where you're talking about what the regulations would manage any upland that are in the map that are more in a
Development on private property, on the banks. of the
property,
river.
not
Yeah.
necessarily
Not in
in the river.
Right.
The Title 2450 requirements apply to the channel. So we're regulating above ordinary and below ordinary.
And that's just, so if I were to put a dock or something in the river, I'd have to get a 404 permit as well as, but that would be, they would be the lead and the city would just have input into that 404.
They're separate permits. So
They would be
if I'm
separate.
doing a capping fill in the river, getting the 404 permit. Also getting the flood development permit.
Is that a new permit?
But what's happening primarily, so my example is flawed because a capping fill typically goes through the Oregon DEQ and then it comes through us, the city of Portland, as an exempt review. So we don't necessarily issue a permit because it's
That's what
accepted by the state.
Okay. got it.
But if I come in as a private property owner and I want to build a dock,
Right.
then that in-water work is still permitted
It gets-
by the city as well as. So
Thank you.
Good to move on?
Follow-up question. In the industrial areas, the floor area ratio is fairly low. So most of the developed area is not structures. Does it need fill to get a floodplain development permit?
I'm not sure I understand what the nature of the question is. What's the?
Most of the work in the industrial areas is not structures.
It's grading.
But if you're grading,
Yeah, and paving and just equipment, outdoor equipment. Does that require a floodplain development permit and fill?
It's a good question, and our grading code, which is our Title 24/7 regulations, is the thresholds for what requires a grading permit. And so the placement of 10 cubic yards of fill typically is a requirement for the permit. So if grading activities are occurring on the site, then that would require the site development permit, and with that would come
Just want to make sure that I'm understanding. So, Steve, so we don't tell anybody to put fill. They need fill for their project, and then it needs to be mitigated, and that's what. And so unless I'm misunderstanding what you said, you're saying, does it require fill? Like the city is saying you have to fill. We don't tell anyone they have to fill, but for whatever they're proposing, for the development they're proposing, if they're putting a building or if they're putting fill in the floodplain, they then have to go through the permit process to show that to show that they have done the flood storage compensation to offset that placement. And it's a volume-based kind of approach. So depending on how much volume in the soil that you're placing, you have to do the same volume of excavation. But nobody is saying that you have to put fill. It's just whether it makes sense for that.
The National Flood Insurance Program doesn't require fill under structures to make them safe.
or to bring them out of the floodplain.
There are two different, think about it like this, when you're thinking about the placement of fill and making it safe. Oh, sorry. When you're talking about fill and making it safe, think about that as a seismic design requirement. That's an earthquake design requirement. That's separate. The building code requires us to make sure that the building meets the seismic design requirements, so it's not going to fall down during a Cascadia earthquake. So making the fill safe is a seismic design requirement, as I understand the question. We're looking at is the placement of fill under today's code requires a compensatory excavation to create a balance of storage volume for flood waters. The FEMA BIOP is telling us that we need to not only compensate for the placement of fill, but also for the placement of structure. Because today I can build a structure and not have to compensate for the lost storage.
But Stephen, I also understand you're saying that there are other flood proofing requirements that are associated, that are required of buildings that are being built in the floodplain, that they would have to meet as well. But and so I guess if you're saying we're making them do it, that is required of any building And it's also in the same section of the code, like what you do to flood-proof anything, any structures that you place in the.
So buildings are required to fill. To fill.
You can elevate a building, build, you can have all kinds of solutions that don't.
But I think
We have some more clarification.
For the purposes of this discussion, I think what we're talking about is we're trying to explain that because these are floodplain regulations, the way it's for the purpose of ensuring that floodwaters don't get displaced, right? So we do not want new development to create a situation in which floodwaters are displaced to other properties. On an individual site, the way you make sure that doesn't happen is that you don't add more structure or dirt without taking at least a commensurate amount out so that we maintain the flood storage capacity. That's what we're trying to convey here.
Yeah, and I think this next slide is important in terms of that excavation, just understanding any implications of the biological opinion.
So, great conversation, great questions, and thank you for jumping in there, Patricia, because I was going to lose sight of the bungee cord and go down the rabbit hole. So this cartoon is trying to illustrate that not only are we looking at having the compensatory storage be a function of placement of fill and structure, but we're also increasing the ratio of the required storage relative to the displaced volume based on the location of work relative to the river, the source of flow.
Can you
So-
do that one more time?
Yes. So the idea here is that we are adopting higher ratios of flood storage compensation.
So the excavation, the ratio of excavation is higher to offset the placement
Of fill or structure.
Right.
So
yeah, beyond 1 to 1.
And so what we're showing here is that we have a high hazard area, and it's this kind of lightish colored zone. It has a ratio of 2. So it comprises the FEMA floodway and the 10-year floodplain within the boundary of the flood hazard area, of the FEMA flood hazard area. So all we're talking about right now is what's applying to our FEMA 100-year floodplain. So again, in the high hazard area, if I put in 1 cubic yard of structure or 1 cubic yard of soil, I have to create 2 cubic yards of storage. And then we look at this riparian buffer area, and we, instead of deciding to use this larger distance, we shrunk that down to the 50-foot setback from top of bank. And that has a ratio of 1.5 to 1. So the thing to keep in mind is that we are applying 50-foot setback from top of bank and applying a ratio of 1.5 to 1. So if I put a cubic yard of fill in, I'm creating a 1.5 cubic yards of storage volume. And new to the code is recognizing that storage volume can take the form of the removal of soil or rock or structures, permanent structures that currently displace floodwater. So it's not necessarily limited to the removal of soil. And then in the remainder of the FEMA 100-year floodplain, we retain the 1-to-1 ratio, but again, it's a function of both fill and structure. And these requirements apply within the central and south reach of the Willamette, with the exception of those industrial properties that I mentioned earlier, and then also the Columbia as well. But they explicitly are not including the north reach at this time.
Well, technically, they'll go into effect next October based on the decision that was made by the city council. I just thought we want to highlight before we move on to the 1996, the new composite map or whatever it would be, is that if, again, thinking about it as a volume. So in terms of, especially for structure, existing development, you're talking about net increase of structure. Increase of fill, but fill is more straightforward. But if you have existing, a certain amount of structure already that's in the floodplain, it's all about, you would need to mitigate the increase of that structure like the difference, the net increase in that, because again, it's a displacement sort of displacement of flood water is really the focus. If you're going to add structure that will now displace more water than what is existing now, then you need to offset that.
I'm just, if you could explain, I'd appreciate understanding why the cut requirement is higher further away from the river. I would think it'd be the other way around.
It is the other way around.
Right, sorry, it's maybe a little unclear because it's.
Sorry, I was.
Yes.
Yeah.
But yes.
Confused.
I knew there had to be a
Yes, it's a murky group.
And Courtney, the BIOP itself actually says 2 to 1 in the high hazard area. So that's the 10-year floodplain, and 1.5 to 1 in the rest of the floodplain. So this is actually already, we have taken into account the developed nature of the riparian area and really tried to hone into where we're going to see fish to make sure that the ratios apply to where the fish are going to be and that we keep the 1 to 1 in the area where the development is.
Do a better job of illustrating the river.
Color coding.
But this slide is intended just to summarize the requirements in our composite February 1996 flood inundation area. And because it's regulating to a higher standard than the FEMA, we're retaining our current balanced fill within that February 1996 inundation area. It's a little complex because it's a 3-dimensional problem. You have to think about it not only in the context of the area that that flood is encompassing, but also what is the elevation of that 96 flood versus the elevation. So taking a look at both of those prisms or fauna. So at any rate, the key takeaway is we're not making any changes to the flood storage compensation in our February 1996 flood area. And then the final bullet point there calls out that these code updates do allow for the use of offsite flood storage mitigation bank credits, provided they're within the same flood area and provided that at the time of the permit, that it can be demonstrated that getting those credits elsewhere will not result in an increased flood risk to the neighboring properties up and downstream. So that analysis would need to be performed.
Yeah, who is monitoring the mitigation bank credits? So I remember when I was at the port, it was always very amorphous. Who kept track of the credits, you know, where we were really able to take them in or so is there something more formal now?
Well,
We
there's,
have a slide that describes, I mean, we haven't gone through that yet, right?
Yeah, we have,
I don't think that's on the slide.
yeah, it's not specific. We are going to talk specifically about mitigation banks, but again,
It's the Corps of Engineers. They have a system called Ribbits, right, VITS, and it's online.
Okay.
It's a formalized accounting system.
All right, thank you.
and I would say that in the code related to the zoning code, we did specifically say sort of what we are primarily doing, unless we'll talk about there's potential for like a city mitigation bank, but is that we would look to state and federal entities to be the ones who are sort of really overseeing what you kind of managed by Bureau of Environmental Services to make sure that the tracking is done. Right now, we are not taking on that tracking on a long-term basis, but it is something of consideration as things, if things begin to expand in terms of the mitigation banks of like different structures and oversight.
So if I'm interrupting you too much, but so if I understand it correctly, which I probably don't, I think you're suggesting that by using the 1996 flood level standards, we get extra mitigation points. Essentially, we accrue those. Corps of Engineers is going to track that for us. And then down the road, should somebody need to mitigate, perhaps they can go to the city and use those points that we've stored up with the Army Corps of Engineers. In other words, what are we doing with those points that we're accruing?
Well, we're not accruing points by creating flood storage within our 1996 flood prism. That was the question.
Well, that's what I think somebody said a little while ago. So I mean,
No,
again,
I think it's two different issues.
Right.
One is by regulating to the 96, we get a discount on our flood insurance.
That's what I'm after.
You
Thank
get a discount. Benton gets a discount.
Points is probably the wrong word,
Right.
but that comes back
That
to the
is-
discounted inflation.
That is a totally separate issue from the mitigation banks and the accounting and the cut and fill that used to be balanced at 1-on-1, and now it's out of balance and have to overcompensate for any fill that happens in the floodway.
Great,
Right,
thanks.
and maybe we'll talk more, I mean, we'll talk more about the details, and I know it's hard to separate these. We kind of had it at the end because it has so much of an implication for the North Reach especially, and just want to go through, but I mean, they are two different things. So to think of the mitigation bank, it's literally like a bank, and they basically, an entity sort of improves, restores a site, and that difference between what the existing condition is, with the improvement is like a bank. It's like money that they have accumulated, and now they're selling that benefit to offset future development. So it's not really, the Army Corps does oversee that, but that's separate from the benefits of regulating the 1996 are more about the National Flood Insurance Program and the reductions in our insurance rates. Mitigation bank is specifically, and those apply to wetlands, and we have now would be flood storage and other habitat type credits that you literally buy individual amounts from an entity that manages that mitigation bank. Yeah. So the last slide,
Bring us on
Keep
home.
going.
yeah, the last slide that we had, other than starting to talk about the implications, is just showing, as Jason said, it's really the updates to these requirements are specifically will apply in the North Reach when we do that. And then also just because we already are through the floodplain resilience plan, the areas in the Columbia corridor that are not in the IH, the heavy industrial, the general industrial 2, and the EG2 general employment 2 zones, with those were excluded from the requirements that we passed in the floodplain resilience plan. Those collectively sort of industrial considerations will be a part of the future update. That is kind of more the area of what we need to consider as part of the EOA. So with that, we had a little bit just about what it means to try to, I know there's a lot of information here and there's a lot of moving parts and it's complicated, but just sort of implications for the EOA of these changes. So so for river dependent, river related uses and development, I think the biggest issue is the flood storage requirements, the additional that 1.5 to 1 and the 2 to 1 for river dependent, river related, because if there is new development that is going to occur in those zones, they have to offset that offset the placement of structure and fill in that area with those higher ratios. And in a lot of cases, it'll be difficult to do that on site. It might be difficult to do on site. That is not as much of an issue the riparian buffer area requirements, as I said, because for the additional habitat mitigation and fish habitat requirements, because if you are river dependent, river related, you don't have to meet that higher standard mitigation standard. So for those types of developments, the zoning code requirements are not as much of an issue, but that offset of the flood storage piece, so the building regulations piece are more significant. If you flip it around, for development that is not river dependent, river related, that is going to be proposed in the riparian buffer area, the challenge is then where can you mitigate, especially in a site like closer to the river. The river banks are, especially in the North Reach, are very developed, and there may not be a great opportunity for mitigation on site given the existing structures. And so now there might be some upland, sort of not at the river interface opportunities for mitigation. But the challenge will be then it brings in this offsite option. The mitigation bank option becomes much more important because there may not be good opportunity to create that fish habitat along the riverbank that would be most valuable for fish. And then, so that's what that last part is, just that mitigation banks, we recognize as we continue to move forward, the mitigation banks become more increasingly important. We recognize we've recognized their importance for quite some time, but Central City is very important because that's another piece where having offsite options are really important for our other goals within the Central City. But I think in the North Reach, it's even more pronounced because of that river dependent focus that we have.
So I just want to just let people know that we go over mitigation bank, you know, with the Natural Resource Council at Superfund meetings, like all the time. And so, you know, if you're from an agency and you're not going to the Superfund meetings, I would encourage you as you dig into the North Reach, because we don't just talk about the Superfund, we talk about the North Reach, especially at the CAG meetings. And so I would just, you would for sure know what the Natural Resource Council and mitigation banks were, because we've gone over them a million times. So I would just encourage you to send people to the collaborative meetings from your organization, because you will get that information from EPA and DEQ and the Natural Resource Council.
And we do track that, right? Like, I mean, we're certainly involved in that. And I think some information later in the slide will show how.
It's the next meeting's coming up, I think, in a week. Yeah. So I would just encourage people, if they're interested in mitigation banking or all this stuff gets talked about at these meetings. So I would encourage people to send somebody.
I was also going to make a note. So we're doing similar to what we did last session. We have maps up, as you probably all seen, to sort of look at some different sites, but we do also have a map showing the floodplain. So we have a map that shows where the 100-year floodplain is, where the 1996 is, and where they overlap. If you just wanted to sort of see in the general North Reach area, it's up there as we start to look at the different maps.
That's perfect timing because we're about time for a break, but I want to see if there's any other questions. Do that. And I think Patricia brought in some snacks for us. So let's take 5, right?
Happy holidays.
11:05.
Our way of saying
Yes.
this.
And then we'll have a little presentation. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, thank you for coming. And you're from us. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, that's right.
It's okay. I did.
Sarah, great to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
I know I was.
No.
For your report.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just think that. Yeah, I mean, it's play that way, but I told you, yeah, did this, but I wasn't gonna lie with his facts. And that I wasn't gonna go scream and yell at city. Oh, is that what it was? I personally was like, to play with the city and to do it every day. And that's what I made. And so that felt like a slap in the face. And it didn't, I can write as well as she can. And I, was really sat down at my mess right back, but I did not do that because I wanted internally. And I think if there is an article, and I don't think that there shouldn't be, then I think one of you should write it to give, if you want the public to know about the process, then somebody should write an article about the process. It's clear for people because so it was frustrating to have an article that wasn't. I think that kind of trust. I'm just used to being in groups where. Never would have occurred to me to write and to do that kind of a thing. I would never. I just hope that I was. I don't know how you want to handle this. But I think we just have to, and maybe when it gets to city council, we want to start doing that kind of stuff, then that maybe is listed in it. At this point, when we're supposed to be all working together, I don't know if that's that we should be acting. So decide how we think about it. I mean, we have a charter and maybe it's some aspects, maybe at the beginning of the next meeting. Which is 2.
Nobody.
So.
No. Yeah. And even people I know, like our whole big group, which is like 30 groups. Bob and I are probably the only ones that have made any real strong effort to understand what's going on. It's not an easy process. And I've had to just really stretch, not my memory, but I have studied, haven't I? I have really tried to understand it, but you can't get everybody to understand. Yeah. Let alone the tutorial. I mean, I'm talking about really smart people. I still struggle. I didn't even understand that they didn't fly over the day after. I mean, I know that seems little, but that's the kind of thing when you're. Yeah, maybe that's a part of storytelling, but they did this fly over, it lowers the insurance. Like, how many meetings have I been to that I didn't grasp that simple story? That's a simple story of, it was a fly over the day after. Who says cost of our. I mean, those two sentences are really important. And to take the lowest, maybe it needs to get broken down. So they understand. When you do what you do, keep going. Can we follow up with you before the next meeting? If Tom's doing that, but I just didn't want to say nothing. You know, we kind of went, we should say. But I did react.
Definitely.
Yeah. Thank you. You say just. Oh. Oh, sorry. Who are your friends? I'm really. Of course. I know that. Great. Yeah, my thought was. Whatever the creation. It's funny. It's year and nothing. You know, I can do with what I know now is simply what you had been urban planning and urban course with them. Not at all. Can we come back together again, please? Yeah. No, what are those people? Yeah.
That's what that's what.
Thanks. So what is she doing about this? Thank you.
That's the elevator.
Folks, I'm so sorry. More presentations.
Come back to.
Good.
You went on vacation?
I haven't.
Thank you all. We'll make sure we leave plenty of time for map viewing and more talking about that. And I believe, Jeff, you're taking on the next section again.
That's right.
Awesome.
Back up.
Okay. Okay, so
For now, we, again, we start with the floodplain with the recognition that it's just a very important consideration in the North Reach. We wanted to talk a little bit more specifically about the North Reach and a sort of future effort to sort of look at kind of different updates in the North Reach. At some point, we're sort of very early on in that process, but just a little bit of background for those of you who may not be aware. So, last month we talked about the environmental zones, which technically are regulated or sort of must meet state planning goal 5 that Daniel went over, which is really very much focused on natural resource and other scenic sort of and protection of those types of things. Goal 15 applies, the state planning goal 15 applies to the Willamette River, the entire extent of the Willamette River. All the jurisdictions have to meet, that have the Willamette River going through them, have to meet goal 15. And it has a little bit of a different focus. Although environmental protection is important and natural resources is important, it recognizes the balance that must be made along the Willamette for things like economic, recognizing its role in the economic development and economic kind of functioning of the state, especially in Portland, recreational activities, historical, et cetera. So all of these, it's much more kind of broad and comprehensive. And so that is why we regulate it differently than we do outside of the Willamette River, what is called the Greenway. So as a result of statewide planning goal 15, all the jurisdictions were required to produce a plan as to how they were going to manage what is called the Willamette Greenway boundary, and the boundary was established a long time ago. We have one ourselves, and it's really the purview of what is the Willamette Greenway plan. Our Willamette Greenway plan was adopted in 1987, still relevant as a general guidance, but we have, and we'll talk about, we've been updating from since then in various ways. So although we'll talk about some efforts, especially the North Reach, that have happened more recently, but the Greenway Overlay Zone, which is still the same thing that we had back in 1988, still applies in the North Reach. And that Greenway Overlay Zone, said largely unchanged since then, it does establish this 25-foot setback for the non-river dependent river related uses. Every property in the Greenway has one of 3 kind of base overlay zones. In addition to your standard base zone requirements, the overlay zone is either you're in the river general, the river industrial, or river recreational for actual parks and things that are in the way. In addition, in some cases, the sort of only real environmental zones we have in the, in the same way we think of it now that we have in the Greenway is the river natural and the river water quality, and each of them have their own unique aspects. It's worth noting that those 2 zones are not applied to the same to the river industrial properties. It's just elsewhere where there are these resources. In the Greenway, there's some standards, so things that you can approvals that can be done just through meeting established criteria, but basically everything goes through Greenway review, which I think is a concern generally with some property owners there. All the development through that Greenway review must meet these Willamette Greenway design guidelines, which were also adopted back in 1988. And Earl Blumenauer was the commissioner in charge at the time. That tells you how old they are. And so it's really, things are all approved through a discretionary process to show, and BDS, Bureau of Development Services, determines whether it is compliant or not. As I said, since the adoption of the Willamette Greenway plan, we have done, and especially early, and I think a number of you, but Bob for sure, were involved in the efforts in early 2000s where we did plan, the city of Portland did planning for the Willamette. It was called the River Renaissance work, and that's where we started to break down the different portions of the site, where we established sort of this idea of a North Reach, Central Reach, and South Reach. As many of you know, we'll go through the kind of the highlights of, or at least the relevant highlights of the North Reach plan. We adopted a plan for the North Reach, and it's the first in the update, the hoped for update of the regulations along the Willamette. Adopted that in 2010. It was appealed. It never went into effect. We did take that plan, components of many of the components of that plan, and then developed what is called the River Overlay Zone as a part of the, and it was part of the North Reach, this new overlay zone that would replace the Greenway Overlay Zone, the River Overlay Zone. So it never went into effect. So the central reach, we actually established the river overlay zone, and that was adopted in 2018. It too was appealed. We were able to overcome those appeals, and it went and was officially re-adopted in 2020. And then, and the project that I was was co-managing, we did a south reach, a river plan south reach, following the central city work. And that was adopted in December 2020, as I mentioned before. And then there were some changes as a part of this most recent floodplain work. There was a floodplain resilience plan modifying, I think, so especially the changes in incorporating the riparian buffer area and those types of things in the central city, and some minor changes in the south reach based on our modeling of the floodplain and a few other minor changes. And that literally was just in October we adopted that. And
Is that the same as the climate resiliency plan? Floodplain and climate, same thing?
no,
Same plan?
no.
Different. Just one.
I mean, it was called the floodplain resilience plan. I'm not sure the climate resiliency plan, which you might be referring to.
Our climate emergency work plan.
So-
I know we have so many.
There's something called the climate resiliency plan.
Really?
Yeah,
This isn't that.
okay.
This is specifically about floodplain. And is it worth saying right here, sorry, Jeff, for just a second, that this was in part starting to implement some of the buyout requirements.
Right.
So did the climate resiliency.
It was in 2014. That was the climate preparation and vulnerability study and the
Climate action plan, maybe?
And then there's the climate action. plan.
It's embedded in my brain. Climate
We'll
resiliency.
have to come back, we'll have to research and come back to you. Yeah.
I mean, I guess in terms of what you're saying, both the South Reach and the floodplain resilience plan incorporated the biological opinion requirements. It was the start of the process of that step, the multiple steps, the phases of implementation that we had in the timeline there for the floodplain work. So just wanted to go over quickly, just for context and understanding, especially as we move forward with whatever a North Reach type effort might look like. So as I said, the 2010 plan was first river overlay zone, although never went into effect. It did have updated requirements and components for the river industrial overlay zone, but it did preserve that focus on river dependent, river related development in the river industrial. For the river industrial, there was no setback that was in those requirements. So again, recognition that the intent of the river industrial is that it's going to be river dependent, river related. So the allowance of development in what might otherwise be a setback was incorporated into that overlay zone. Everywhere else in all the other zones. And so one of the things we would do as a part of any future work is, in theory, develop a river industrial zone, kind of reincorporate it, update it, and put it into the zoning code to again meet current needs as compared to now. That's 13 years ago. 50-foot setback everywhere else. And then a key part of that plan was what was called a vegetation enhancement standard. So right now, as you might know, like the IH zone, for example, has no landscaping standards. The way in which this was addressed to try to get more vegetation on these sites was through this enhancement standard. And what it said was that the long-term, the goal was that all of these properties would be 15% vegetated. But it also said, in recognition of trying to not overly burden industrial development, it had a cap on the amount that could be spent to come in compliance with that 15%. And so basically at that time, it was $200,000 or 1% of the total budget of the project. You could only spend so much. And then the expectation was, if you come with subsequent proper projects on a property, once you get to that 15%, you don't need to meet the standard anymore. This vegetation enhancement standard was met. It also had a fee in lieu option, which is something we'll consider, but especially for the floodplain work, a fee in lieu doesn't allow, the federal government doesn't view fee in lieu in the same way that we would, and see it as compliant with the biological opinion. And Caitlin can talk more about that more specifically. But of note, so as I said, there's very few standards in the existing Greenway overlay zone. So again, every project has to, every proposal has to go through Greenway review essentially. So as a part of the river overlay zone in 2010, we incorporated a number of different standards that were specifically, that was also the first time that river environmental overlay zone was a part of this, the North Reach. And in that river environmental zone, we had standards for a number of things, or I would assume important for industrial development, things like bulk, expansion of bulkheads and replacement of bulkheads, cargo conveyors, rail right of way, site investigations, tree removal. So the bottom four actually versions of those are in the current river overlay zone now, but this was the first pass at it. Another key sort of process update was that we did have standards for corrections to environmental violations, so that instead of again having to go through land use review, there were kind of criteria. If you did happen to have an environmental violation, you could meet these standards, these criteria, and not again have to go through the river review for approval.
Jen, two quick questions. A couple quick questions. One, is Greenway review, is that a staff level review?
That was the stuff.
Okay, great. And then the fee in lieu that for vegetation enhancement, that was not actually enacted, is that correct?
That's right. It was.
Plan wasn't.
Yeah, it was because it was all part of that package. So at that time, it was essentially assumed that the fee in lieu would go into a fund, and I think BES was going to, we had as part of the plan identified sites for restoration, and the expectation was that fee could be directed to that fund, and then there would be improvements within the North Reach that would achieve the same goal. But we never, I mean, in the E zone, in the environmental zone, we do have an option for a similar type of fee in lieu. We don't currently have a fee in lieu. So then whatever this future North Reach thing, we just wanted to sort of talk about kind of the overarching goals, and then I was going to just kind of give the basics of what the river overlay zone includes. But anyhow, we clearly are looking, as part of this effort will be, we'll engage stakeholders of all the different perspectives to understand and maybe update whatever that long-term vision is for the area, apply zoning requirements to be consistent with our processes elsewhere in the city right now, because it is so dependent on land use review, et cetera. There's a lot of opportunities for improvement through things like standards and all of that. But really the focus, updating our requirements through the zoning code to increase clarity and certainty, approval through standards, environmental regulations, which are consistent with what we're doing elsewhere, hopefully. And then also how, especially related to that river industrial zone, like how can we better support economic developments in the reach? And then, is river dependent, river related what we are looking to do? And what does that mean? And how does that, all of those kinds of big questions are all things for consideration in this effort. So river overlay zone, like I said, currently applied in the Central and South Reach as part of those past efforts. There are kind of these base zones. Similarly, we added the river recreational as a part of the South Reach because we have parks and things in the South Reach, but we have the river general, river recreational, and the river environmental. Throughout that area, we have a 50-foot development setback. So essentially no development can happen in that 50-foot setback, and that's from top of bank. And then the overlay itself, kind of broadly outside of the river environmental requirements, we have landscape, specifically red landscape standards for the setback, exterior lighting requirements. Those are some highlights of what we have there. For the river environmental, so we have a draft map. We have two draft maps of kind of the full extent if you wanted to look at, and we will look at these. We've selected individual sites similar to what we did in the last session, but these are kind of the criteria, which is drawing on what we have done in the Central and South Reach as to where we apply the river. We would expect to apply the river environmental in the North Reach. So basically within the 50-foot setback, and then also the similar distance from any streams and wetlands. The riparian buffer area, again, if it goes out, so that's the 170 feet from ordinary high. Sometimes ordinary high and top of bank are different, but in a lot of the cases in the North Reach, it's just going to be the same or very close to the same. But anyhow, 170 feet from that, if it's in the floodplain, if the floodplain doesn't extend 170 feet, we stop it there, but that would be all of the floodplain in the riparian buffer area because of that expectation for improvement to the fish habitat. We also apply beyond that area anything to what we went through the natural resource inventory last time, and there are maps to show for each of these sites some of our natural resource inventory rankings, but anything that is high and medium ranked riparian resource, similar to what we've done in the past and consistent with our our metro requirements, we would expect to apply the river environmental there. This area, the thing is called the special habitat area, details in the North Reach is not as prevalent as outside. and specifically for the environmental overlay zone, it becomes, it's a little bit more significant in other parts of the river. So there are, so of course, we have a range of things that are exempt, including operations, maintenance, replacement, without, as long as the building doesn't, or the structure doesn't expand, et cetera. There's a whole number of different exempt activities. As I said, we do have a number of standards that already exist in the river overlay zone, and I think we could, for a future project, we think about, or future, we think about how we could better tailor these, or how well they fit with the needs of the North Reach and industrial uses and activities. But we do already have a good number of standards that apply in the river environmental. And that again would allow for a project or a proposal of applicant to not have to go through land use review all the time. Again, we have the map that shows, if you want to look at it, this is just sort of generally where the floodplain is. I think one of the key takeaways for the floodplain in the North Reach is it's very variable by site. It's where it extends. There are a handful of sites where the floodplain is covering large amounts of the site or significant amounts of the site. But a lot of the property, the floodplain, especially because it is so developed and because of things like bulkheads and wharfs, something like that, the floodplain does not extend very far onto the site. So we will, as a part of this future, sort of getting, as we start to scope things and work through things, look at the different sites where there are significant, where the floodplain extent is significant on the site. We'll start to look at solutions and, our options for, dealing with those types of challenges. As I said, there's a map of using those criteria, and the criteria are identified on the map, just so you can take a look in the room here and see where the current river environmental, kind of draft river environmental applies. This is just a quick summary. I know it's probably hard to read, but just sort of where we are for the North Reach in total, and especially because we're focused on those industrial zones, IH, IG2, and EG2. You can just sort of see for the North Reach in general, within that combined flood hazard area, it accounts for about 26.5%. We break it down by the 50-foot setback and then the riparian buffer area. So about 15% of the remaining, I think these are remaining after you take out the 50-foot setback. So any additional riparian buffer area is 15% of the total, and then, or maybe no, it's total. Okay, so that actually would include, there's some overlap between the 50-foot setback and the riparian buffer area, and then the final column on the right is so in total for the entire North Reach, it's about 30% that would be in the river E as it stands over the land area. There's a similar breakdown for those industrial zones. So for the most part, we can focus on, especially for the river E, it's about 23% of those properties that are IH, EG2, and IG2 that would be in that draft river environmental zone. So just a little list, I'm sure, and we have, for those of you who know, there's a lot of interest in here. So we have some flip charts, and I just thought we'd have, if there's any ideas, any other things you wanted to just note for us for the future, any future work in the North Reach, other considerations. But, as I said, I think our considerations for as we move into that the North Reach would be things like the river industrial and a new river industrial overlay zone, assuming that we were to replace what's in the Green Water overlay zone. What does it look like? What is its considerations? What are the requirements? Can we come up with standards that would help make things more kind of consistent and wouldn't require land use review? We'll talk about the Superfund site in the next session in January. I know there's a lot of interest for the CEI hub and all of that goes along with that. Potential for river access, trails and viewpoints would maybe not. A lot of that, well, that was at least originally in the previous river plan North Reach was addressed part of the comprehensive plan update, which was in the mid 2010. So we'll evaluate that. And then just some general, the idea would be we do some cleanup and things like that in the zoning code and any map updates that we need.
Okay, Jeff, I have to speak, sorry, because I represent the community. The Greenway Trail is on Highway 30. I don't know whether any of you have ever driven on Highway 30. That is our trail for the entire North Reach west side is Highway 30. That's our,
Is it smooth?
That's pretty good that you would have a greenway trail on Highway 30 is outrageous. It's not even safe to walk on. Our kids can't get to school that are in high school because there is did you know they're cutting all bus transportation to Lytton? I'm not sure how children are supposed to even get to school in the North Reach. There is no river access in the entire North Reach besides Cathedral Park, which has no playground and no covered area. It is an indigenous documented area. We have not once acknowledged that we have treaties, federal treaties that have stood up in the Supreme Court saying that we are obligated, just as we're obligated to do FEMA, we are obligated to get the fish through that area. And we are obligated to give at least the tribes, and I think working class people, a way to get down and catch a fish for their dinner. We are obligated to do that. Did you just listen to Portland Public Schools for a month? The kids have learning disabilities in North Portland. It's no wonder. All you have to do is go on the EPA health thing. Your chances of living in North Portland are 10 years less if you've lived there your whole life. I mean, I live there, but I live up in the forest, but it's not okay. It's not okay to have a trail on Highway 30 for people. And it's not okay that we're never mentioning that we have a tribal responsibility to the North Reach. And I'm a midwife and I'm an educator. That's why I'm here. Because you cannot keep poisoning the children in North Portland. Cannot. So look at these maps and we'll do the setback. But at the point that we don't come up with a solution that's healthy for the people of St. John's and North Portland, you know, that's the bottom line. The bottom line is that statistic for people in North Portland has to change. And if this is the method, this is what we'll do, but it cannot stay the same.
Thank you, Sarah.
Sorry, but that's why I'm here, because I'm not going to have a higher mortality rate for mothers and children in one part of the city.
Right, so I think thank you so much for that.
Sorry, I know I'm emotional, but if I wasn't emotional about this, I wouldn't have the energy to stick with this.
But I will just say, want to make sure that we as a group understand our focus. And the focus is on the EOA, industrial land, and how this presentation, again, is another in the series of like understanding what are the constraints as it relates to industrial land and what that means for the EOA. So the slide that we are showing here is, you want to make sure to understand the sort of 360-degree view of what's, of the issues in this area. But this forum is going to, stay focused on the EOA. So this is kind of like a little bit of other considerations that we want to make sure that if there's space here, that comes up, we'd love to capture it. But it's, we're still trying to drill down on how much industrial land is going to be available for industrial use in the next 20 years. And that's our focus for this conversation.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tricia, but I want to double down on what we just heard, because I think it is really important to understand the decisions we make on industrial land have a direct impact on the adjacent communities. And we are talking about the greenway here. And if there's not a greenway, then people are forced off the river and onto the highway. And so I think it's completely germane, because as we make trade-offs and decisions, we can't pretend that the industrial lands exist in isolation, just like we can't pretend that they don't affect the natural resources or listed salmon. So I mean, I appreciate when people bring these things in. I think we need to capture them and understand them, because we are going to get to a point of trade-off. And if it means that kids are walking on the highway rather than next to the river, that's important to understand. And then what we did with the river plan in 2010 would have precluded a continuous greenway, which we don't have now, but would have made sure that we never ever have it too. So I appreciate that information.
Sure.
Just to balance here. Any other, or do you have more?
Well, I think if there's just any conversation about North Creek, we were just gonna, there's a couple of slides and have Caitlin talk about kind of efforts related to mitigation banking. I mean, as we've discussed, yeah. just wanted to- Any other questions?
Well,
Yeah.
the only thing Corky brought up something last month that really sort of stuck with me, and it's the difference between how the natural resources inventory that the city has created, the difference between the high and the medium resources and how that compares with what Metro created. And I think we need to understand that a little bit, like, what is that difference? So if you were asking for additional things to be done, it would be helpful for us, because what I have heard is that we are doing much more than maybe what the FEMA requirements are necessarily in the city of Portland. And so and maybe that's just my own way of translating it. But I think when the question was asked, how does what we're doing here compare with what FEMA standards are? And we're doing more, or what is being proposed is more. So I think just for us to really understand what the implications are, we kind of need to go back a little bit and understand what the natural resources inventory changes are that were made here versus what Metro has.
And that's Fabiana's comment. Let me just say, I think let's just make sure that we're talking about those are two different things. So the natural resources inventory, we largely, that is compliance with Metro requirements. That's just how we evaluate where our natural resources are and then what are the most valuable of those resources. Whether that doesn't necessarily have a whole lot to what we're doing related to the FEMA requirements, because those are very sort of specific to, we know what those requirements are, and it's specific to that those FEMA considerations. So although floodplains and those types of things are included in natural resource inventory and how we rank things, and it's the two sort of separate things.
I do understand
Yeah.
that. I understand that point. I guess the point I was trying to make is that that through the FEMA process, you as a jurisdiction have 4 paths that you can go down. And one of the paths is to show that your standards today address many of the requirements of and my only point is simply, I think we do need to understand the details. Those are important because it translates to impact to industrial property as well as cost of.
Maybe I could just say, Jeff can correct me, and then I know Bob can jump in. I think the 2021 implementation plan, the information that we have available from FEMA to date, which is not final, it offers suggestions, right, about where the rules are going. The city, in this latest process and in previous processes, I guess the South Reach, we have taken those rules and tried to apply them locally in a manner that's also tailored to our conditions. So hence the detailed explanation that Jason gave about, how the requirements in FEMA are X and we've sort of, done Y, for example. I think another goal of the city is to, whether we are doing exactly what the guidance says thus far, it's more looking cumulatively at all the things that we're doing and saying we are doing as a city a package of things that we feel, are helping to reduce flood risk and are also helping to improve, beyond today's conditions, habitat for fish. And so it's not just what we did that got adopted in October of this year, what got adopted in 2020. It's the collection of all of these things and other things that we do, that VES does to restore wetlands and to do floodplains habitat restoration. And that's those are the resources we're talking about too, right? Like wetlands are a resource where there's significant important trees or vegetation, those are resources, and how close they are to to water, which is the explanation we gave last time, right? So it's all of these things. And so if the question is, are we doing more than is required? I mean, I would safely say that I think we're doing an approach that's tailored to us, that in some cases it might be more, in some cases it might be a little less, but the totality of the package is what we're looking at.
Yeah, and I don't want to, what I said is I'm hearing, but I don't understand if that's really correct. And I'd like to be able to understand whether or not it is.
Okay.
If we can go in order a little bit, it would be helpful. I think we've got 4 people since that was next. I would echo what Jeff said. There are different things, although inventory covers some of it. I would also emphasize that the BIOP was very, very prescriptive. I'm happy to provide the link to folks, but it was very prescriptive. So when we talk about things like the ratios for mitigation, those are in there and they're in black and white. They're not particularly hard to find in there, although it's a long document. And so there's not a lot of room for interpretation. Actually, there's different pathways to get there and show compliance, but there's not a lot of room for interpretation when they say 2-to-1 mitigation ratio. That means 2-to-1 mitigation ratio. I would also note that FEMA is out of compliance with the BIOP. They've missed their statutory deadlines. They're getting sued again for that. And so are all the jurisdictions, including Portland, are out of compliance with the biological opinion. Right now, development is not being held to the standards of the biological opinion. So the projects that are going in are out of compliance, and I think they're also vulnerable to litigation on that basis as well. So I think it'd be great if we could get more grounding in the biological opinion, but I just want to make sure people understood that it is very prescriptive, doesn't leave a whole lot of room for tailoring it to this, that, or the other thing, although there are ways to get there. They're complex.
And that guidance is interim right now, right? Like just to be, the 2021 information that's available is interim.
The biological opinion, though, had statutory deadlines. FEMA missed them. They're getting sued for that. And basically, they're talking about the different pathways you can use to achieve compliance. But compliance is going to look like what's in the biological opinion. So when it says that you need to have these kinds of setbacks, you need to have these kinds of standards, it means exactly that. That's not going to change with the guidance that's coming out eventually. And again, FEMA has already missed its statutory deadlines, although the biological opinion was released in 2016. It's now 2024. So a lot of development, unfortunately, has occurred that has been out of compliance with that already. I would note, too, that FEMA had interim measures that were supposed to be implemented very quickly because they knew it might take a little time. They didn't expect 7 to 9 years. And City of Portland hasn't used those either. So the City of Portland could have put in interim measures over the last decade that they haven't used. So there's a lot of issues with where we're at and how little progress we've made. And I don't think we need to wait on their final guidance for how you implement it in order to know that we need to do certain things right now.
Bob, any other comments or questions before we hear a little bit more about mitigation thinking? Yeah.
Sure. I'll just connect Susie and Bob said, I hate in my mind, which is mysterious and important place. But part of what I think I heard Susie say was, let's try and be as objective as we can with our data. And that's what you were just saying, Bob, is in the BIOP anyway, is prescriptive, relatively black and white. That's great. The NRA, I think what Susie was referring to when we talked about NRI, excuse me, NRAs, well, that's a whole nother. Where did that come from? We haven't heard from them in a while. So when we're doing the NRI, what we've seen in the past anyway is it's a very subjective analysis. These are natural resources. Medium is these over here. Why is that medium and not low or high? It's very, very subjective. And then we're taking that subjective evaluation of our resources and using that as a basis for applying setbacks. And it would be nice, I think what I heard Susie say is it would be nice to have a little bit, as best as we can, because these things are subjective, but as best as we can, make an objective analysis or relate that NRI, for example, to what another city would have done, what their standards would have been, just to give you some point of reference. And then, once we've got a good idea where we really sit with our natural resources relative to other cities, relative to what other locations do, then we can say, we want to go above that. But instead, we seem to be getting we seem to be told sometimes that here's our objective analysis, when in fact it's not objective. And then using that to set other standards. Does that make sense? That's the concern.
Yeah, I mean, I would push back hard on that actually for a couple of reasons. First, I think the city has very technical, scientifically supported way methodologies for using it. Those have been scrutinized over the year. Every group in this room, especially the industrial groups that track these things very closely, had every opportunity to weigh in on those, comment on them, push back on them. They went through adoption processes. Again, no one tracked those things closer than industrial interests, other than maybe environmental groups. I was at every one of those hearings, so were you. And so, you know, they've gone through an adoption process, and the idea that we're gonna, and I think we see this every time we get to industrial lands, there's this perception that, wow, well, maybe we need to go back to square one and redo all that. No, these things are iterative and they build upon each other, and the train left the station on that. But I would say, you know, to reinforce that, in fact, no, these are metrics that were used in large degree by Metro. They went through huge adoption processes there. The city of Portland refined them down, big adoption processes there. They're not random. It's not somebody going on and going, wow, that's a really neat stand of trees. It's based on benefits for fish and distance from the river and large woody debris, and, you know, a lot of different factors that we know are critical, large part to fish, but to other species as well. There's massive amount of documentation as to why those metrics are used. So I think it's easy to kind of keep going back to, we should do this over.
One thought.
Last one.
Yeah. Just want to say that is what the presentation, I think last time, losing track a little bit, on E-zones was, and explaining the NRI. So there are, each of those designations of high, medium, and low in terms of the natural resources have specific criteria associated with them. That's what Bob was describing. I would offer, Corky, that we would send you that presentation again and highlight for you the slides specifically that outline what those criteria are.
I've seen the maps.
Yeah, no, it's not just the maps, though. It's like what constitutes a medium resource, what constitutes a low, and it's the things that Bob was just describing, like how valuable they are as a habitat, how close or far from wetlands or river. Those are and there's others that I can't think of right this moment. But
Okay, I'm gonna push back. Because I think this is, and I don't want to get into an argument too much over it. You know, what Bob said is at least 50% accurate. I mean, I really do agree with it.
That's good for me.
Hey, I'd be proud of it. So I don't want to dive in, but I do want to push back on this. There is a lot of subjectivity. Now, going back a number of years with Nature and Neighborhoods, they came up with an NRI maps. And then a short time later, the city came up with their NRI maps. And you can look at the two maps, parcel by parcel, and over again, see is the lines between low and medium value were pretty much in exactly the same spot. A little bit of variance here and there, but for all practical purposes, lines were at the same spot. But where Metro rated something low, the city rated it medium. Where Metro rated something medium, the city rated it high. And over again. Again, some variables here and there, but consistently. And I brought this up with Bureau of Planning, and shortly after the Metro online maps disappeared. I don't know, yeah. So to tell me that there's not a subjectivity there is incorrect. I'll give you another example. When we started mapping the proposed P zones in my neighborhood where I live, which is in North Portland, near Willamette Boulevard, on Willamette Boulevard. And it's on the bluff, The P zone went through my backyard, went through my neighbor's kitchen. But then when it got to the house where at the time, the director of Bureau of Development Services lived, the P zone did this, we went around, you know, it's sort of like, I don't want to make an accusation that's not fair here, but that was a really curious curve around that property. Yeah. So to tell me that there's not a lot of such subjectivity there is just, in my mind, inaccurate. So that's my pushback. And I would value having, staff say, yeah, and these are things we struggle with. We work on it, we do our best, and I think staff really does do their best on that. But let's not misrepresent it. It is very subjective, and that's where we end up with these problems that Bob's just referred to, where we keep going back over to it over and over again. I don't want to go back to it over and over again either. It's frustrating.
Just to quickly add on,
No,
also, how do they get changed? What's the process
Yeah.
to change them
we're
and
gonna come
update
back
that?
to that another time. Benton, I know you wanted to speak, and then I know this is passionate for everyone. I'm not trying to close down the passion. We anticipated this. I do want to have more of a discussion than we're having right now. So I'm gonna go to Benton. I'm gonna go to Caitlin to talk about mitigation banking, and then I'd like us to go to the maps and have some more actual dialogue with one another.
I'll move it because I think I'm just going to reinforce what you just made. From my perspective here, I think it'd be from a process standpoint, very helpful. Susie asked a very reasonable question, like an information request.
Yeah.
And I think it would be helpful if we would just take those information requests and not get bogged down in debate about them. Like, reasonable question, let's take it and let's move
Figure
on.
out how we
Yeah.
can respond. Thank you, Benton. Great.
Okay, well, I'm
sorry,
going to
Chip.
first kick off.
I'll let
and
you
then
go.
I'll let Caitlin
Yes.
talk about mitigation things because she knows so much more. But anyhow, just wanted to talk very quickly. I know we're kind of want to make sure we have enough time for the maps. Just how we do mitigation in terms of our requirements. So just to know, in the context of mitigation banks, we do require that it's sort of first the step is avoid, minimize, mitigate. So you're trying to minimize how much impact you're going to have on natural resources to get as much as you can. When you are going to have impacts, try to minimize it. Then you have to mitigate. And then we have on-site mitigation is our priority. If you have the ability to do it on-site, you have to do it on-site. But we have over time, and we recognize the benefit of mitigation banking, especially because mitigation banks have oversight, and we can be sure that the mitigation survives in perpetuity generally. And so we have been working on how are we accommodating and trying to expand in some cases, hopefully, mitigation banks. So there, and I will, like I said, I will let Caitlin sort of talk about generally where we are in mitigation banks. We do have 2 existing mitigation banks. I think in terms of the question of oversight and all of that, the mitigation banks that we have right now are specifically designed to serve the Superfund site. Talk about those just really quickly. There's one that's the Linton plywood site, the one that's for SOAR-CAP, and then the PG Harborton, and both of those. And I guess there's also
Those are DSAs though.
Alder Creek. Right, so that's why they're specifically they serve a federal function.
But not the flood.
They do.
Well, so
Okay,
that
yes,
is what that's what they were, ostensibly, that was their purpose, is to support Superfund. And that's sort of also the economic driver, is that they have that certainty of the Superfund, that they serve those improvements. Since over this process, and most recently we've been working, they have worked with the trustees for the Superfund, the natural resource trustees, to identify value for the flood storage piece of it that is separate from what is serving the Superfund site. Can straighten everything out. But anyhow, so now those credits, they still would be overseen by the trustees, but those are available as separate credits for flood storage, both at Linton.
But you said they were oversight.
They are the purchase of credits are recorded with the Corps of Engineers and on a publicly available site. So it's just, you can track it that way.
But and we don't necessarily need to get to the details, but so just the allowance of use of those credits is through the trustees, because they have to make sure that the function the bank was supposed to meet, to serve the Superfund, is preserved. And then it says, oh, there's this additional value that is in flood storage, and they come up with a I'm sure
don't wanna double count.
complicated, algorithm for how they determined it and calculation for how they determined it. But so we have available credits for flood storage specifically. So the reason the Superfund connection is so important, the Superfund is about the habitat piece of it. And so we can't take advantage of the habitat piece, especially as we talked about how it will become more important in North Reach to have options for offsite habitat. Can't use those banks for that, but there are credits we understand are available for flood storage specifically. That's what that bottom bullet says, no available habitat mitigation bank specifically for what we're looking to do. There is a potential, we've been working on a potential future bank at OMSI, East Bank Crescent. I'll let Caitlin talk about that, but just quickly, this is sort of what we know about capacity. And I know like you probably means nothing, the 16,000 cubic yards, 57,000 cubic yards. And we will do further evaluation. We did this largely again because we recognize the value in the central reach, but those are basically, you can kind of see generally, prices that as we understand it, amount of capacity. And then the differentiation would be that the East Bank Crescent won't just be flood storage, but would allow for someone to purchase a credit and meet sort of called a stat credit, meet all of the sort of federal, state, and local requirements in one purchase. And that's why the cost of theirs a little bit would be higher. With that, I will just turn it over because Caitlin and Bureau of Environmental Services have really been working out a lot on mitigation banking.
So the two banks that we have in the Willamette River, the Linton Plywood and the Harborton, are what we call private banks that were specifically for NRDA, the Natural Resources Damages Act. So they were designed to meet a very specific purpose. And we were able to negotiate, as Jeff said, with the trustees to really pull out flood storage from that. But it did, to Debbie's question, the way that we were able to do that was to, the banks have their currency. I kind of compare it to Bitcoin, right? Like you don't really know what it is, but it's a form of currency. They have DSAY, DSAY. It's the discounted service acre year as their credit. And the trustees approved that, and each bank has a certain number of DSAYs that they've been approved to sell. When we went to them and asked for the flood storage, because flood storage was not part of the calculation for NRDA, they said, we will let you do that, but it has to come out of that DSAY. So we have to convert it. We have to convert cubic yards to a DSAY, and it has to come out of your total bank account, basically. So that's a different kind of complication. But for those of you who work in NRDA, that's what you would go to them and buy is a DSAY, and a DSAY gets converted to cubic yards. However, you cannot buy the habitat credit. So those don't count for all of the other elements that the FEMA buyout is requiring development to mitigate for. So while we can get flood storage, you cannot get habitat out of that, and you can't get your stormwater and water quality component. So we needed another option. So we are moving forward with a bank at East Bank Crescent. We actually just got a Metro 2040 Industrial Readiness Grant to get that off the ground. And so that would allow us to create a project there. It's very small. It's about 2.7 acres that would lay back the bank, bring in habitat, and that would actually count for both habitat and flood storage. So you would buy it as a single credit, but you kind of get to count it towards all of the components. And that's why it's a lot more expensive. The thing to Sarah's concern and question that we're going to do is because NRDA and Superfund is such a very different legal requirement, with East Bank Crescent, we are actually going to design that so it does have a trail. And the way that we're designing it with ONSI is to actually have the tribes have CritVic actually do the design work, so that it's got a very strong Indigenous focus to it and allows for things like cultural practices, allows for things like first food gathering. And we'll build that into the approval process with the folks who approve banks are the Corps of Engineers, Department of State Lands, in this case, it will be NOAA Fisheries as well, and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. So those folks will get a different idea of how a mitigation bank in the city could work, where we could and bring in some of these other considerations as well. But we're going to be pushing the envelope on that. But it is because of the concerns of community that we think that's worth doing. That we're hoping to have credits for sale from East Bank Crescent by 2027. And this will be the first public bank in Oregon. So most of the banks that you see out there are for-profit banks, so they're pulling off a profit from them. This one would not. This would be a cost recovery bank. DSL is very excited about that, and we're working really closely with the agencies to come up with the methodology to move that. I want to say there, so you have the steps.
That's your question. So if I understood you correctly, the city purchased E-Saves from Clinton and PGE?
We did not.
Flood?
No, so we basically made it so that individual developers could go to those banks and purchase those credits. We basically helped write the rules to make flood credits available.
What's
So
the currency for this?
it's actually DSAs. But so you would go, so here's some of the examples that we've run into. Actually, there's one right now and it's a BES project. So we have a pump station that we have to improve, and it's going to require some fill, and they cannot do the balance cut and fill on site. So we went to Jason and said, how much fill do we need? Or how much credit do we need? What's the cubic yardage? And I think it's going to be like 750 cubic yards. So then our BES team calls up Linton and says, hey, we need 750 cubic yards of cut credit. And they say, great, that's the equivalent of 0.2 DSAs. We're going to sell you 0.2 DSAs, and here's our cost per DSA. And then we do that transaction with them. It's just a private sale. And then we go to Jason and show Jason the receipt. And Jason says, yep, check, you've met that requirement. And that's how that works.
And that's through the permit?
That is through, it's like a private marketplace. It's like you're literally going to a bank and buying a CD or a Bitcoin or something, and you're just showing Jason the proof of sale. And then that banker, so in this case, RestoreCap, says, okay, I sold the DSA. Hey, Corps of Engineers, with your tracking system, you need to show that I sold the DSA. So of my 240 DSAs that I had for sale, now I have 238.8. And that's all available on a public website to track. And they have come up with a system now to say that particular DSA was very specific to the city of Portland floodplain requirements, not to NERDA. So they're separating it from their superfund obligations. That took us about a year to get to that agreement. And every site is different. Every site is different. So what's available at Linton is different than what's available at PGE. And because they're private banks, the prices are different at each of those.
Love your Bitcoin metaphor, but hopefully it's more stable than that.
I don't know. The Supreme Court recently kind of played with the market. But yeah. So this is really an emerging field. We really are kind of out in front on the state with it, but we are working really closely with the agency so that we can stand something up that serves as a model for the state. And what we're trying to do from the industry, given the complexity that you guys have all gotten here today, we want to make it a place where it's a one-stop shop, where you can go and buy these credits, and then you can go to the Corps of Engineers and say, here's my 404 requirement. I met it here. Here's my NOAA fisheries fish requirement. Here's my DSL requirement. And here's my city of requirement. And you get it all by writing one check. So we'll have all of those levels of approval with the banks.
I just wanted to follow up, but so this idea that we're sort of pushing things forward. I mean, I think for FEMA, for example, flood storage banks and credits, it's all new. That's a new thing. And so we are engaged in the National Environmental Policy Act to work with FEMA to try to help work through the details of what the implementation will be, et cetera. And then we have been pushing them to really figure out from their perspective how mitigation banks are a key part of the overall strategy for jurisdictions. I mean, not every jurisdiction is going to need mitigation banks, are going to want to prioritize mitigation banks. So for places like us where we are very, we're densely developed and sort of maybe more challenging in terms of options for different mitigation, on site elsewhere. making sure that we have that as an option and that they have clear direction in terms of how it should be managed and overseen and how, what our role is in making sure, you know, other than just sort of deferring to the existing processes that stay at the federal level, but also making sure like, how can we be sure that we are meeting so they can provide us with the guidance they need in terms of what they expect for mitigation banks as an option.
Jeff, I love mitigation banks as a tool. I think it's a great tool to have. Obviously, one of the concerns is your first desire is to mitigate on site, or to not have an impact, and then mitigate on site if they need to mitigate, and then go to the mitigation bank. Are there? I'm sure I know that as these mitigation bank concepts are being developed, that's a concern. Is there a standard that's kind of coming out about when do I trip to go into an offsite mitigation bank?
So
I don't know how to ask the question, but I think
the federal system, and it's both the same for the Corps and NOAA fisheries, and it's also embedded in our Title 33, is that you first you do what you can to avoid the impact. So if you can avoid cutting a tree, don't cut a tree. Then you can minimize it. So, okay, well, you might have to get pretty close to the tree. So you're going to do a tree exclusion fence, right? You're not going to cut it, but you might impact the roots, but you're going to try to minimize that, right? So that's a minimization technique. But for some development, you're just going to have to cut the tree. And you don't have a place to put it on site because you put in a parking lot instead. So that's the hierarchy of avoid, minimize, and mitigate. They really depend on you as the applicant to demonstrate how you have both avoided and minimized and mitigated on site. And then only when you have unavoidable impacts that can't be mitigated on site are you allowed to go off site. What we've done in the code, and this is different than in the past, is we've made the ratios the same. So that if you do on-site mitigation, it's a 1.5 to 1 mitigation. And if you go to a mitigation bank, it's 1.5 to 1. So you don't get penalized or incentivized from staying on site. And part of that is because the mitigation banking concept, those are restoration experts and those are protected in perpetuity. Whereas the on-site mitigation, you guys as industry are not restoration experts. And then the maintenance obligation is also something that you would be saddled with. So this gives you an opportunity to go off-site and actually, we get the assurance of the longevity and the function and perpetuity of that. So we wanted to make sure that there was no disincentive for going off-site. And there used to be in code.
Yeah.
Well, also, Corky, to add on to that, Evraz did a riverbank project where we put a cap on our riverbank, and we incorporated and worked with the trustees for that project and NOAA to develop, and other parties use experts to come up with a habitat equivalency analysis. Mm-hmm. So we looked at, so you use a habitat equivalency analysis that the trustees have numbers associated with that the experts that know how to do all that come up with the habitat equivalency analysis. I assume you guys have done some of that for the central. Yeah. So it's the project people doing the habitat equivalency analysis that marries up with what the trustees have matched.
Can I add one more detail? I know you want to visit on this.
Yeah, I was we're actually also asking, when is it justified to go off-site, which I think was yeah, and I always think maybe I can follow up with, I think we use sort of the same approach that Caitlin just described, but in terms of that's a determination that Bureau of Development Services makes as to, when you have to come and you do a land use review, you do alternatives analysis, and it says that, there's based on my allowance, there's a lot of different conditions, like what are my allowances based on the base zone and all of those types of things. What's the existing development, all of that, of course, it is in terms of your questions about subjectivity. That one is, I think, more subjectivity in terms of you've identified all these different analyses, and to balance the different goals, at some point they make a determination. It's probably not very satisfying in terms of like, yes, this is when it is okay and when it isn't, but I can follow up and specifically about, any general guidance they use to determine when, on-site is not sort of directly required, and they start to say it's acceptable to move off-site.
And to Susie's earlier question, that's where you would have sort of the safety concerns. You would say, okay, the safety concerns basically prevent me from doing something here on site. that's a reason to be able to go offsite, and we want to make sure you have that option available.
Makes a lot of sense.
The one thing I did, especially for folks who were a part of the North Reach originally, we did have the in lieu fee. That there is not a pathway for an in lieu fee. So in 2012, the federal government changed all of their mitigation banking rules. So after we did the North Reach, the entire sort of system changed to be more accountable. In the buyout, there is a mention of allowing an in lieu fee, payment in lieu, and that has significant costs associated with it. So because of the time lapse, right, you would write a check, but you don't know when the actual mitigation is going to happen. The way the buyout is very prescriptive is that it says you have a 25% increase per year of delay. So in Puget Sound, we've called up to Puget Sound. They have a fee in lieu program, but they do not use it for any fish impacts. They're not allowed to use it for any fish impacts for that very reason. And the tribes oppose it. So we would not consider it for a couple of those reasons. One, we think it's a big penalty on the developers, and two, we think that it does not have tribal support. So we're moving, and under the federal rules, the approval process is just as onerous and as complicated as it is to do a straight up mitigation bank. So we've made the decision to do the mitigation bank so that the restoration is available for you to buy into right up front, and it actually will keep your costs lower.
So Caitlin, I have to ask the question, do you know, based on the banks that you have now, how close you are to meeting the requirements that are going to be necessary if these policies are implemented in terms of the industrial land that's reduced, and you know what the expectation is based on new policy regulation?
So we don't. What we did do, we spent a lot of time at BES doing like a supply and demand analysis to determine whether or not we would have enough mitigation banks to meet the development demand. And that was based on our current rules, not on any proposed changes. But the short of it is that we need a lot more mitigation banks. The nice thing about this, though, is especially if I think there's some areas here of mutual symbiosis, if you will, where you might want to, or a site might not be right for river dependent, river related use. T2 is a great example. Pulling back, you have a long strip then on the waterfront that could actually be made into a mitigation site and still do so as an allowed use under the IG2, and it provides revenue to the landowner. So you're supporting industrial development where there is a need for river dependent, river related, but you're not being held to that standard on those sites. So I think there's room for us to see how we could get both. It's a both and conversation in the North Reach as opposed to an either or element.
Thank you. We have a little less than 20 minutes on your calendars. I think this is what I'd like to do. We've already had a few requests for additional information. We'll do what we can to fill those. I've seen Tom over here scribbling, and I'm sure he's not the only one writing those down. I'd like to, we can spin, I'm just going to move the agenda around a little bit. We said we'd do maps and then we would come back. We're not going to come back. We're going to, when we break here and go to maps, we're going to look at maps. We're going to like work out of the room. Going to leave as you so wish. But because of that, I just want to see, are there any additional outstanding concerns or questions while we have the direct attention of Caitlin, Jeff, and Jason?
We're going to get Jeff's presentation.
Yes.
Thank you.
And that will get posted on the website as well. Any, and of course you can talk to them.
Right.
Yeah. And then Jeff, did you have a vision about anything over here?
I mean, not really, other than it's very similar to what we did last time. So I was going to sort of step through and we'll be around, and then and somewhere we have some stickies if you want to either stick some things up, particularly on a particular map, or like I said, we have the flip charts, but try to over here so everyone can see. So similar to what we did last time, we have the natural resources inventory. We didn't go into the details of that because we covered that, but that's just sort of for a given site. On the bottom left, we have how we ranked the different areas. We have this map that shows kind of what would be regulated by Title 33 in terms of the things that we talked about. So we have the riparian buffer area, and you can take a look at the different symbology, but riparian buffer area, 50-foot setback. The blue is the combined flood hazard area, and to understand where technically, especially because kind of to that question of our ratios for the cut fill, you see this little blue line is the ordinary high water mark. So that basically anything beyond that is the land, where the land starts. And then, but then so this purple for each of these is kind of the draft river environmental. So so you can translate sort of these different areas and the riparian resource values into where we would propose to put the river environmental. And then this is just a reference because for Title 24, as we talked about, we have a different designation, not the riparian buffer, but the high hazard area, which could be much closer to the river. But that's also shown here just to see on a given site where those higher ratios would apply. We still have the combined flood hazard area, but because again, we have differentiated that these requirements, Title 24, the building regulations, the higher ratios, et cetera, are in the 100-year floodplain. We have the 100-year floodplain identified for the Title 24 maps.
What's wrong with this blue chart, what those ratios are using that map?
Yeah, so the high hazard will be the 2 to 1.
Okay, so show where that is.
So all of this blue, you'll see it here. And the thing is that in some cases, it's, there's the orange is the 50-foot setback. So basically the area between the line that is the hatch. And in this case, it's actually very small, so it's sort of hard to tell. But if you see on this, it's a little bit better on this one because you can see this is the extent of the high hazard. So in this red hatch, you'll have the 2 to 1. And basically in the area between the red line and the orange line, because we just did a line and not a full area for the setback, that would be where that 1.5 to 1 would be. And then anywhere beyond that, where you have the 100-year floodplain, we would have that 1 to 1, which would include both fill and structure. So it is the same 1 to 1, but now any new structures that are placed in here would be subject to that. And then the remainder outside of the 100 years where we're not changing anything, it would still be the same existing. That's the 1996, essentially. Anything outside of what that's blue like this, that is not shown in the 100-year is going to be where the 1996 is.
So I just want to ask an obvious question. So right now, none of those things apply.
That's right.
Yeah, so this is all.
This is all just, again, in terms of, we would consider all of these in terms of when we're going back to the capacity question. It was all about what are the implications of these types of things for the industrial land.
And this is, just to clarify, this is modeling,
Right.
this is modeling the application of these provisions from other areas, modeling similar to, if we applied those same kinds of regulations in this area, this is what it would look like. So it's just a kind of a starting point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to make sure we're clear here too, maybe obvious, but it doesn't say you can't develop. It says that you have to internalize the costs of your environmental impacts rather than externalize them, which is what we've been doing. So it's making development pay its way as opposed to simply filling floodplains and letting it go unmitigated. Correct.
We would say we just have to mitigate your development. Yeah.
But internalizing the costs of the impacts is what we're really talking about here, rather than externalizing, which is what we can do.
Which is a great clarification, thanks. But the middle map is the environmental zone overlay. I presume we're talking P zone. It's clarified here.
No, that's one of the things. So the river environmental doesn't work in the same way. We don't have like a P zone. The only thing, the equivalency is for the river environmental, essentially the setback is like a P zone, although we allow the river dependent river related in this area. The Willamette, again, it's just different. It's and so when you look at the map here, which are really, if you're talking about sort of trying to kind of correlate the approach, the setback is sort of like the P zone, because other than river dependent river related development or uses, we would not allow development in that setback.
That starts to get complicated.
And then outside of the setback, basically the river environmental is modeled, it's very consistent with the environmental conservation overlay zone. So it's functioning in the same way. It doesn't say you can't build there. So all of these areas here, you can't, it's not saying you can't build, assuming you're outside of the setback. You just, and to what Bob said, it just means that you now have to, we've identified these as natural resources that if you impact them, you have to make it.
Thank you. I think we should all stand up and start getting more familiar with these sites. I think every map that's a specific site has a little diagram up here.
No, I haven't done it all.
Program, yes.
Your perspective.
These are all these.
Yes.
Yes, so that's what we were, what Jason was talking about earlier. We, the 100-year plan with one. Come up to the LiDAR data, we got all that. We updated. And the night. That calibrated model is now. Exactly that. And then you are. Yes. We can find out.
So it's just we've got it. So stories.
It's actually.
Because I'm this here.
Okay, yeah, I'm the insurance district liaison. Okay. Northeast.
Great.
But I'll be kind of looking out on the north reach, north river. So, yes, a lot. Well, I'm sure we'll be talking more. Yeah, so do you support a geography or how does it work?
This is.
But
I would like sort of
Right, so
Oh, okay. I worked on environmental team for a while. Yeah, so I know. Very interesting meeting. Yeah, that's my first time. Community meeting. Well, I just started it a few weeks ago. Yeah, so very, there's a lot to absorb. There's a lot, yeah, I know, that's what I was like, trying to get familiar with this town. And I was like, oh, there's a lot of different plans that are involved in this one plan.
Right,
Yeah.
And like all the different things are like, the different regulations.
Yeah. Well, it's not the same. Yeah, it makes it quite hard. So that's more. Oh, that's fair. Yeah.
None of this.
Yeah, interesting. Really exciting. Like, I think it means a lot. Also,
It's based on our night.
too much stuff on the page, like, oh, okay, like maybe it's not something we can do in this project, but there's other projects that are happening that maybe that's like, right? That KH in theory, happening here, where, you know, that might be our thing, right? That. Area was just not happening to us, maybe that's. Something that's happening to us.
But now it's like.
Maybe around, yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, so your name is Marie. Marie. Okay, nice to meet you. No, it's a That's back. Yeah. Yeah, and we will see you at the next meeting. Yes. Okay. Yeah, perfect there. Sorry for coming in and. Oh, no.
Yeah.
What are you looking at?
Like, they're all. Part of the We don't, we basically are saying this is kind of the best data that we have today. And then in 5 years from now. It's not in those rules or even. Say, we're So there's a variance.
Well,
That'll change in time.
Yeah.
So we need to bring.
It came back from floodplain. Lines. The difference.
We just. That's the county law, the bottom or the PDA space is in a model. It's part of it. I did, evaluation. That's okay. That's how they are.
and now it's 20.
Yeah.
So it's pretty now.
Somebody's gonna drop like.
But also, I mean, let's play this. And of course, like in York City, I think I still got the way on.
We get into this. But I guess what it's where
There's a hybrid. So think about site. Yeah, so anybody. Especially if the maps change. Exactly. It wasn't.
How was that? In terms of EOA.
Right, right. In the middle, there's three. Last thing, there's. I think it's one.
Wasn't used to offset.
Is that?
Like, imagine if you're inside out, that fish is gonna go up on the bank and get out of the flood. And then when the.
Exactly. That is really.
It's there, that if they don't build up, then it's not. Floodwaters are gonna go someplace and that fish is gonna go someplace. That fish no longer has the fisting. So that's what's why. Different.
And it's like they're
It's really complicated, but for your purposes, I think, you're right, everyone was definitely. I mean, you've already done so much, river mix, so it's not gonna be a lot. There's also, you know, that's what we're feeling right to see. Right now, actually, they don't know.
They made that fight.
You guys just go online and plug it in and it'll tell you.
We're doing hard.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're gonna leave that.
It's doable.
Beach.
Oh, I know. Yeah. Yeah, I know.
No, it's actually south. I'm sorry, north of us. It's the whole parking lot. So we're in bridge. If you imagine that, there's the reason we call it precedence, is it basically.
Yeah.
What we'll do is we'll get back to the link.
I mean, it's gonna be fascinating.
No. That's where they're at. When you know what a submarine is, you walk under the Markham Bridge, the access bridge, I see that bridge and then.